many occasions to focus on the pride we take in the AAPI community, the inspiration it is to come to Chinatown, Japantown, to our communities of diversity in this district and across the country, and the concern that we have about these assaults, these hate crimes against AAPI. So here we are in Portsmouth Square. 1 week ago, we were in the White House with the president when he signed the legislation. For a while now, then, as Callie referenced, we have had our meetings with our regular meetings that we have, accelerating them, intensifying them, even before Asian Heritage Month with his May. We had one of our meetings in the end of March 31st. Then we were at NEMS, the Northeast Medical Services Center, to talk about COVID, but you can't talk about that without talking about the assault on the community. The president, from the day one of his inauguration as President of the United States, within 24 hours, he was calling upon the Justice Department to take steps to document and to prevent AAPI hate crimes. When he talked about COVID, his first speech on COVID to the nation, he talked about stopping AAPI hate crimes, and then, of course, last week to sign the bill. We were very proud because it was a bill that had very strong bipartisan support in the Congress, almost unanimous in the Senate, big strong vote in the House, strongly bipartisan. I salute our Grace Meng in the House, and Mazie Hirano in the Senate, and Tammy Duckworth in the Senate, and Judy Chu, the chair of the KPAC, of our Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus in the House, and so many others who made that success possible. But what is important and what we know is we have to keep talking about it so that people know what opportunities are there for them. They know to make a distinction between what someone might just call a casual reference, but if you hear the language, you know it is a hate crime. Again, typically, AAPI communities have been the hardest hit now by COVID. And so we have this AAPI hate crimes, and we have the COVID at the same time. Native Americans and Pacific Islanders have high rate of death. AAPI-owned businesses are shutting, stigmatized by racist conspiracy theories. Anti-AAPI hate crimes are spiking, 6,600 incidences. The president cited that last week when he signed the bill. Those were reported last year. We think the more that have not been reported, and with seniors attacked, businesses vandalized, families in fear. Here in San Francisco, we've seen the pain in our own community. We mourn with the family of Visha Rotonapakti. We pray for the recovery of Dwi Fong Eng and another victim, and we salute the bravery of Chao Jianxi. How about that? Her bravery. This horrific violence, these are just to name a few, this horrific violence demands urgent action. Again, that's why we passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. Just so you know, the bill strengthens our ability to prevent, report, and combat hate crimes, and will help protect not only AAPI families, but all Americans from bigoted violence. We did this for the AAPI community, but we really are doing it for America, to make America live up to our standards. We're proud, again, of the bipartisanship of it all. And we're very proud that President and President Biden, Vice President Harris played such an important role in making it the law of the land. So here we are getting ready now for our American Jobs Bill. On Tuesday, under the leadership of the KPAC, of Judy Chu, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, we heard from 10 leaders of 10 organizations. I don't have to explain to anyone here the beautiful diversity of the Asian community, Asian American community. so many manifestations, and we heard from them about how the Filipino community, which is very much in the lead in caregiving on COVID, has been disproportionately affected by infections and deaths. We heard in a discrete way from every manifestation of the community in terms of diversity, but also in terms of the purpose of their organizations, which will enable us, by listening, to do more to rid our country of this cancerous impact. It's not lost on anybody that the Asian community has been a tremendous, Asian American community has been a tremendous resource to our country. We talk about the fact that in World War II, people were risking their lives to fight in the war, World War II, for our freedom, while their family members were in camps. One of the things we're going to do that we talked about on Tuesday is to make sure that the National Park Service has the resources to have for interpretation those camps, so the public will know, so people won't forget what we were sadly doing at that time, so that we do not do it again. And now I see a school group is here to see the appreciation we all have for Chinatown. It's always wonderful for me to come here. It's I always feel sorry for my colleagues that they do not have the advantage that I have to represent such a beautifully enriched community of Asian American Pacific Islanders. So with that, I want to salute all of the groups who are doing so much. As I close and turn this over back to Kali Wang and thank her for her leadership once again, and as we hear from our other guests, I just want to comment on the tragedy that the employees at the Santa Clara Transportation Authority. So many families suffering from gun violence in our country. It has to stop. And we will not stop until we get the legislation to protect the American people. When this happened in Georgia, an AAPI community in Georgia, I was so proud that Senator Feinstein came forth and said that she was willing to adjust her attitude toward the filibuster, so that we would only need 51 votes to pass the gun violence protection legislation. Hopefully more members will come to that same values-based decision that she did. But this is all connected. It's about violence in our country, one way or another. And our thoughts and prayers are all of who have suffered from violence, and of course within the past day or so, what happened in Santa Clara. Our families are in our hearts and in our prayers, but that's just not good enough. We have to act. We have to take action to pass legislation for gun violence protection. With that, again, I thank Kelly for her hospitality here today. Kelly Wang, say what she is again, Director of San Francisco API Council, a leader of advocacy on behalf of the AAPI community. I yield the floor back to Kelly. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Nancy. Long time no see.
Thank you, Speaker Pelosi. So I know we're short on time, so I'll be quick with introductions. Our next two speakers, I'm proud to say, are both API Council members. For our next speaker, we have Sarah Wan, the Executive Director of Community Youth Center and the co-founder of Coalition for Community Safety and Justice. So for those who don't know Sarah is a fierce champion in our community who I've personally witnessed solve some of San Francisco's greatest challenges with grace, poise, and just all-time team player. And as the woman at the helm of CYC, which serves over 5,000 youth each year, assisting low-income, at-risk, and marginalized youth in academics, employment, leadership, substance abuse, violence, you name it, she'll do it, and she'll do it for the community. She's just, again, all-time team player. And within the last year, she's been actually the go-to women assisting victims of hate incidents, hate crime. She's there at 3 a.m. in the morning. She'll be at the hospital. She's always available. So with that, Sarah, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Kelly, for your warm introduction, and good morning, Speaker Pelosi. Thanks for having me here. I don't speak really fast, so short on time is not a problem for me. So, it's my great pleasure, and also really glad that we have passed the COVID-19 Hate Crime Act. It's not only speed up and strengthen the DOJ's response to hate crime, and most importantly is how it supports state and local government to respond to by establishing online hate crime system, collecting data, and very importantly, how to work with local community members, community organizations to develop community-led driven solutions to combat racism, especially against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. As one of the founder of the community of the Coalition of Community Safety and Justice, our work has been focused on three-pronged approach. The first one is how to actually, with the community partners, work together with the city department to develop citywide safety planning, especially for the AAPI community. A lot of times when a victim engaged or has been a victim of a crime, they have to deal with many different departments. How can we ensure that it's lean language, culturally competent, that really target the very diverse Asian American and Pacific Islander community? So we really need to develop a coordination service plan. Second, we would like to work very closely with other ethnic groups and also other communities to really build solidarity across different communities so that we can not only deal with community healing, but really have an open dialogue with other, especially with Latinx and also Black community together to combat racism against all forms or all communities. And last but not least, that CYC is leading on is the community outreach and the wraparound support services for victims of crimes. Since we established the coalition and starting our service in late February, we have served already over 25 victims just in San Francisco. And over 90% of them, they are elders. And they are very vulnerable and they feel very tragic, because they are part of this incident for not doing anything wrong. They are all unprovoked attack, which is something I have never seen for my 20 plus year of life serving the community. But what is very, very, very lightning for me is that when I talk to all these elders, they're very fortunate that they survived. And the most important message they gave me is how can we support that no other elders will suffer again. Nobody will be attacked again. And I really take it close to heart. And I really want to thank Speaker Pelosi and all the major stakeholders that we come together to combat racism. I hope we are not only dealing with this issue only during the pandemic or only during the May API Heritage Month, but for many years to come. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So our next speaker, Dean Ito Taylor. He is a champion in his own right and the fearless leader of API Legal Outreach, which provides legal advocacy for our most marginalized folks in our community. Under his leadership, his organization has launched programs serving immigrants, seniors, and domestic abuse survivors. In this last year, Dean has been the go-to representative for our immigrant small business merchants in Japantown and Chinatown, making sure our merchants had legal representation to renegotiate their rent and to avoid eviction. Let's welcome Dean.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Speaker Pelosi, for always being there for the API community, even when we had a different administration. You were always a champion for our community. From time to time, I like to remind kid Speaker Pelosi that she represents the heart of Asian America, and she has the burden of carrying our message to lawmakers who don't have the privilege of having in their district a Little Saigon, a Soma Filipinas, a vibrant Pacific Islander, Korean, South Asian, Southeast Asian community, the oldest Japantown, and the largest Chinatown in the country. As API Council members, I'm very proud that all of these nonprofit service providers not only shifted resources to aid our community when the pandemic hit, everything from the distribution of food to PPEs to home delivered meals. I think that Annie Chung of Self-Help was delivering meals to seniors. I was getting PPEs out of the back of Sarah's car. But upon the surge of anti-Asian violence, once again, the API Council agencies shifted resources to assist victims and their families, as you've heard Sarah and Callie talk about. But more importantly, we have recommitted to our unity with other communities of color. We were reminded of our common histories and our joint futures to combat racial injustice. Just as this legislation, this hate crimes bill, has great meaning in our efforts to prevent anti-Asian and Pacific Islander violence, we look forward to the legislation that will prevent the deaths of people like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. My agency, API Legal Outreach, provides legal assistance to survivors of racial violence and those who are fearful of the violence. Every day when I'm in the community, I talk to people who are afraid, fearful of the violence. I go to the bank and the tellers tell me about hostile customers who accuse them of bringing the disease to America. I go to restaurants. The doors are locked. I have to call in to pick up a to-go order because the owners are afraid of random intruder violence. And they're also afraid of going out of business because people don't want to come out and give them business because of the fear of violence. I talk to seniors, and they skip their lunchtime nutrition program meals because they don't want to stand in line on the sidewalk and feel vulnerable to random violence. The API community has long suffered a history of racial violence, from the violence against Chinese railroad workers, Filipino farm workers, the incarceration of Japanese during the war, the burning down of Chinatowns, the abuse of Vietnamese fishermen, the violence that we saw 120 years ago in the form of women being trafficked from Asia and saved just up the street at Cameron House on Sacramento Street, to today with shootings, stabbings, beatings, and bullying of our young people. Our community will not be silent. We will advocate for change. We need to educate ourselves, our neighbors, our friends, our allies. But this is not an API community problem. This is a problem that America has. And our country needs to solve this problem. This legislation, this bill, is a great first step toward that solution. But we all have a lot of work to do. I want to thank Speaker Pelosi for her leadership, not just today, not just with this legislation, but for the history of her service to San Francisco. We also have to acknowledge the essential work of Senators Duckworth and Hirano, Representatives Meng and Chu, for their efforts in getting this legislation passed. As President Biden said upon signing this bill, silence is complicity. Just to end, our hearts go out to the families and survivors of the shooting in San Jose. In just a terrible way to start today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean and Sarah and Callie, Sarah, and Dean, for making all of the connections that you have made. That this is about America, this fight that we're having for the API community. I would like to have you all closer because for the questions, and they want to draw you into that. And I think we're pretty safe here in doing that. Dean just most recently, I mean, he's the most recent, I'll spring from some of what he said about George Floyd. 2 days ago, we had the family in the Capitol, and the president had the family in the White House, again, to raise the visibility and to say that it's really all connected, and that when Dean talked about transcontinental railroad and the credit that was not given the Asian American, the Chinese American community for building that. Now in retrospect, people understand better, but it shouldn't take this long. But the list goes on, and I won't, he said it so eloquently, I won't repeat it except to say how important it is. And again, I want to just salute our mayor, because we were with her just a couple of weeks ago with a Chinese American. We had dedicated the Ed Lee housing project for veterans and people from the Asian Pacific American community. The collaboration of us all working together, and the mayor has been very, very forward in her rejection of the hate crimes and has acted upon, been a leader in some of the initiatives. With that, any questions that you may have?
In case you can hear me, President Pelosi, I want to ask, after the act, will there any funding for the Asian community in the homeland? Because now it's really more care about the life, especially the COVID-19 life.
When I mentioned about NAM's needs at Northeast Medical Services that we were on April 7th, last month, I was announcing that we had $11 million going into that initiative. What's important about that is, even in a broader sense, is that that community was an example to the country about how to address the COVID issue in the communities of color, culturally, linguistically, appropriately reaching out. So again, the example that is set of national significance makes it easy for us to attract the resources. I mentioned earlier about when we are talking about the Park Service. Well, some of my members, like Doris Matsui, was born in the Canada. She was born in Canada. They've been fighting for the, shall we say, proper interpretation of all of that. That takes resources. But as we go into the bill that we're building, the bill we did, the rescue package had significant money that went into communities of color, specific language, very diverse, to be appropriate in how that money was spent, recognizing the high incidence of infection and death in the Asian Pacific American community, A. B, as we go now into the infrastructure bill, and that's one thing we talked about on Tuesday with the groups, to have the community in the conversation about how we go forward for housing and for education and for safety in terms of drinking water and the rest, to listen to the concerns of the community. Where money will be allocated, we want to make sure it is allocated in a new way, to build back better, not to build back old, but to build back new, and that's what the president has said. And then we have our families initiative, and within those two bills, the infrastructure, the jobs bill and the families bill, we have enormous resources that directly help the community, even though they are more broadly written. For example, tens of billions of dollars for child care. Many people can't go back to work because their children, they don't have child care for their children. But in addition to that, the people who would be providing the child care are largely from communities of color, largely women. And we have $400 billion for senior care, largely provided by women, many women of color. So that it says that they should be properly compensated, properly trained, and respected for what they do. So it's where is the activity that needs to have the proper recognition, and when we do it, it is not to perpetuate old ways of doing it at the expense of the beautiful diversity of our country. I think people will be very pleased at how we go forward in that regard. And as I said the other day, we had 10 organizations specifically talking about specific ways that the legislation we're doing should address them. In fact, some newer ways that they were proposing. Yes, ma'am.
Pelosi, you touched on yesterday. Do you have any specifics for the victims' families on how gun legislation can be moved forward?
On yesterday?
Yeah. Do you have any specifics for the victims' families about how gun legislation will be
But
moved forward?
we spend a great deal of time with the survivor families. We have a regular basis where they come to the Capitol, and we reiterate the commitment. We're not going away until this is done. We must pass this legislation. And so while so many of those families, Addie Scott right here in San Francisco has been a leader as a family member, lost her son, to try to make the connection in a way that people turn their grief into power to save other lives. That isn't bringing their child or their family member back. But I'll tell you who's been a champion on this for messages to the family is President Joe Biden. When we have the gathering of the survivors at the Capitol, before he was president, he would come as vice president and then as not vice president anymore, but just as a recognized leader in our country. He would sit with them alone. The rest of us would not be in the room. He had lost two members, two of his children and his wife. So he belonged to a club none of us wants to belong to. So he could listen to them in a shared state of loss. And that was so appreciated because he took the time, he listened to them. So my members are tired of moments of silence and proclamations. They say, yeah, that's interesting. But it is no substitute for action to make sure it doesn't happen again. And it's one of the reasons that we want to pass H.R. 1 in the House, which will reduce the role of big, dark, special interest money in politics, which is how the gun lobby operates. It's a shame. It's a shame. But we are going to persist. Every example that you can use around the country will have a pulse anniversary coming up soon. The Georgia issue is fresh in our mind, and now in San Jose and Santa Clara County, this tragedy. Our hearts break over it, but that's just not good enough. We have to have laws passed that prevent it from happening further. But in the meantime, a recognition that our hearts, prayers, and thoughts are with those families. Do you have anything to say about guns or how money should be allocated?
As part of my speech, it's very important for the state and local government to work closely with the local community partners, community organizations, together to truly develop a community-led, community-driven solutions to combat the anti-Asian hate, violence or hate crime. And we're doing it in San Francisco, and I really have full confidence that we'll do it for the state and also national level with our great leader.
That is so important because the idea that we have these capable organizations which have the trust of members of the community. So if we're trying to do outreach, better to come from these community groups, that these are community-based solutions, again, that have trust that has been built over time, personal relationships, but also on the ongoing for the organization. We really cannot do it effectively without that. That's central to it. And if there are no other questions, I thank you so much for being here. And again, I affords me the opportunity once again to be in Chinatown. I love going to Japantown. Just recognizing, as you mentioned, the beautiful, beautiful diversity of the Asian Pacific community in San Francisco, a source of inspiration to us. And again, solutions that are of national significance. Thank you all very much. As we go into Memorial Day, let us recognize all who fought so hard for the freedom in our country. And we owe them, for the sacrifices they made, we owe them a country worthy of their sacrifice. And that is a country that is free of all of these hate crimes. Thank you so much.